Imagine this: 100,000 years from now, a human walks across the Martian surface with lungs built differently than yours and a brain wired to handle isolation that would break most people alive today. That person isn't wearing a bulky suit anymore. What would have to change inside us to make Mars our home? And here's a question for you. If you were the first human to set foot on Mars, what message would you send back to Earth? Let me know in the comments. I will pin the most creative answer. Now let's begin. There's a real medical condition happening to astronauts right now, in low Earth orbit, that gives us a preview of what generations of Martian life might eventually look like. We'll get to exactly what that means in a moment. But first, let's talk about gravity, because that's where the transformation really begins. On Mars, gravity is only about 38% of what we feel on Earth. Scientists studying astronauts aboard the International Space Station have already documented how microgravity weakens bones, shrinks muscles, and even reshapes the human heart over months in space. Now stretch that out across generations. Researchers in the field of human physiology speculate that humans born and raised under Martian gravity might develop longer limbs and lower bone density compared to Earth standards, but with bones and muscles perfectly tuned for that lighter pull. This isn't science fiction hand-waving either. It's rooted in real evolutionary biology. Just like Andean populations on Earth evolved bigger lungs and different blood chemistry to handle high-altitude, low-oxygen environments over thousands of years, a Mars-based population would likely undergo similar targeted adaptations, just shaped by a completely different set of pressures. Radiation exposure adds another layer to this puzzle. Mars lacks a global magnetic field like Earth's, which means surface radiation levels are significantly higher than what we experience back home. Some researchers have proposed that long-term settlers might develop enhanced DNA repair mechanisms, similar to organisms already thriving in high radiation environments on Earth. Like certain extremophile bacteria found near nuclear reactors, skin pigmentation could shift too. Just as human skin tone evolved on Earth partly in response to different UV exposure levels near the equator versus the poles, scientists have floated the idea that Martian settlers exposed to unique radiation patterns might see gradual pigmentation changes over many generations. And here's something wild to sit with for a second. NASA's own human research program has already found that time in space alters gene expression. They discovered this through their famous twin study, comparing astronaut Scott Kelly to his identical twin brother back on Earth. Some of those genetic changes didn't fully reverse even after he returned home. So the real question isn't just whether the human body can survive Mars, it's what the human body eventually becomes after enough time there. And that shift in thinking changes the entire conversation from one about struggle to one about transformation. But here's the thing, the mind might actually need to evolve even faster than the body does. Isolation is one of the 5 major hazards NASA has officially identified for deep space missions, right alongside radiation and altered gravity. Being cut off from Earth, with communication delays of up to 22 minutes each way during certain planetary alignments, creates a kind of psychological distance humans have never truly experienced before in our entire history as a species. Studies from isolated environments right here on Earth, like Antarctic research stations and simulated Mars habitats, such as the ICEAS project in Hawaii, show that crews experience measurable shifts in mood, group dynamics, and even cognitive performance after just a few months of confinement. Some psychologists studying these environments suggest that long-term Martian settlers may need to develop entirely new social structures and coping mechanisms, almost a new psychological toolkit built specifically for permanent isolation from the rest of humanity. There's also a fascinating idea floating around cognitive science circles worth mentioning here. Prolonged exposure to an environment with a different horizon, a different sky color, and a longer day length than Earth's might gradually reshape our internal sense of time and spatial awareness. That's because so much of human cognition is deeply tied to Earth-based sensory cues we've evolved with for hundreds of thousands of years. Add to that the psychological weight of living somewhere. Every single mistake could be fatal, and you start to see why some researchers believe surviving Mars long-term isn't just a technological challenge. It's a test of an entirely new kind of human resilience, one we've simply never needed before. So we're not just asking Mars to accept a version of us built for Earth. We're asking an entirely new version of humanity to emerge, one shaped physically and mentally by a planet that demands change if you want to stay. If this kind of thinking about human evolution and our future in space excites you as much as it excites me, hit subscribe and drop a like. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and it means a lot to have you along for this ride. Let's talk about something you probably never think about when you picture life on Mars: your circadian rhythm, that internal clock ticking away inside every cell of your body. It turns out this tiny invisible system might be one of the very first things that has to change if humans are going to make Mars home. A day on Mars, what scientists call a sol, lasts about 24 hours and 39 minutes. That sounds almost identical to an Earth day, right? Just a little bit longer. But here's the open loop worth sitting with for a second. Even that small difference, less than 40 minutes, has already caused measurable problems for mission controllers and scientists working with Mars rovers back on Earth. During active rover missions, some engineers actually had to shift their entire sleep schedule to match Martian time, essentially living on Mars time while their bodies stayed physically on Earth. Many of them described symptoms similar to a permanent, rolling jet lag that never fully went away, because their bodies wanted to sync with a 24-hour rhythm while their work schedule crept forward by 39 minutes every single day. Now imagine that happening not for a few months during a mission, but for an entire lifetime, generation after generation. Some circadian biologists have speculated that a colony of humans living permanently on Mars might eventually develop internal clocks slightly recalibrated to that 39-minute difference. It sounds small, but human biology is incredibly sensitive to timing. Hormone release, body temperature regulation, even the timing of cell repair processes are all tied to that internal clock. A population living under a slightly longer day for long enough might gradually shift its biological rhythms just enough to feel completely natural on Mars, while feeling subtly, persistently wrong if that same person ever returned to Earth. This is a strange thing to consider, because it means a truly Martian human might not just be biologically different in an obvious way like bone density or muscle mass. Some of the differences might be so deeply wired into daily biological rhythm that a Martian-born person could feel physically uncomfortable simply readjusting to Earth's shorter day, the same way someone flying across many time zones feels foggy and disoriented for days afterward. There's another layer to this worth exploring, and it has to do with light itself. Sunlight on Mars is dimmer than what we experience here on Earth, roughly 40% as intense, because Mars sits much farther from the sun. Human bodies rely heavily on sunlight exposure to regulate vitamin D production, mood, and yes, that same circadian rhythm we just talked about. Some medical researchers who study seasonal affective disorder here on Earth, a condition where reduced sunlight during winter months triggers depression-like symptoms in many people, have raised concerns that permanent reduced sunlight on Mars could create a kind of chronic, low-level version of that same condition across an entire settled population. This is where the story gets really interesting though, because human biology doesn't just break under pressure like this. Sometimes it adapts in ways that completely surprise us. Populations living in far northern regions of Earth, places like parts of Scandinavia and northern Russia, already show measurable genetic and physiological adaptations to low sunlight environments, including differences in how efficiently their bodies use available vitamin D and how their internal serotonin regulation responds to shorter days. If humans stayed on Mars long enough, similar adaptive pressure could theoretically push a settled population toward biological changes that made reduced sunlight and a longer day simply normal. Not something to overcome, but something built into their biology from birth. There's also a psychological angle here that researchers studying isolation and confinement have flagged as a real concern. Human beings are deeply tied to light and darkness cycles for our sense of time passing, our sense of productivity, even our sense of connection to a shared human experience. On Mars, dust storms can dramatically reduce sunlight for weeks at a time. During one particularly intense global dust storm that NASA's Opportunity rover experienced, sunlight was blocked so severely that the rover's solar panels couldn't recharge its batteries, ultimately ending that mission entirely after many years of operation. For a human settlement relying on solar power and natural light cues, an event like that isn't just an inconvenience. It's a serious threat to both physical survival and psychological stability, because it removes the very rhythm your body and mind depend on to function normally. So when we talk about adapting to Mars, we're not only talking about surviving radiation or handling lower gravity. We're talking about an entire recalibration of how your body understands time itself, how it interprets light, darkness, and rhythm. And that recalibration might take generations to settle into something that feels, to a Martian-born person, completely and totally normal. Now let's shift towards something even more fundamental to human survival, something most people never even consider when they imagine life on another planet, the human microbiome, that vast invisible ecosystem of bacteria living inside your gut right now, quietly influencing everything from digestion to mood to immune function. Researchers studying astronauts aboard the International Space Station have already discovered that spending extended time in space measurably changes the composition of the human gut microbiome. Some beneficial bacteria populations decrease, while others that are typically less common on Earth start to increase in relative abundance. Scientists don't fully understand why this happens yet, though many suspect it's connected to changes in diet, stress levels, altered immune function due to microgravity, and even exposure to a completely artificial, sealed environment instead of the diverse natural world our bodies evolved alongside for millions of years. On Mars, this effect could become even more pronounced. Settlers would likely eat a highly controlled diet, grown in artificial greenhouse environments rather than natural soil, exposed to filtered air rather than the wild diversity of microbes floating through Earth's atmosphere and ecosystems. Some microbiologists studying this exact issue have proposed that over multiple generations, a Martian-born population might develop a gut microbiome distinctly different from anyone living on Earth, shaped entirely by a closed-loop, artificial environment rather than the natural world most humans have always lived within. This matters more than you might think, because your gut microbiome does far more than just help digest food. Emerging research increasingly links gut bacteria composition to immune system strength, mental health, and even how your body responds to stress and inflammation. A Martian population with a fundamentally different microbiome might, over time, develop immune systems calibrated to a completely different set of biological threats than the ones humans have faced throughout our entire evolutionary history on Earth. That could mean increased resistance to certain conditions common in sealed artificial habitats, but potentially decreased resistance to diseases and pathogens common back on Earth, creating a strange kind of biological divergence between the two populations over enough time. Some researchers have even speculated, somewhat controversially, that this kind of long-term biological divergence between an Earth population and a Mars population could eventually create meaningful differences in disease resistance, digestive efficiency, and even subtle differences in behavior linked to gut-brain communication, an area of science that's still relatively new but growing rapidly in terms of research interest and funding. What's fascinating here is that none of this requires anything close to science fiction technology or genetic engineering to happen. This is simply what natural biological adaptation looks like when you place a population of humans into an environment radically different from the one we evolved in. Evolution doesn't need permission or intention, it just needs enough time, enough generations, and enough consistent pressure pushing biology in a particular direction. And that's really the heart of what makes this topic so compelling. We tend to imagine Mars settlement as something engineers and technology will solve entirely on their own, through better suits, better shielding, better greenhouses. But biology itself is going to be doing its own quiet work in the background the entire time, slowly reshaping whoever chooses to stay long enough to call that planet home. Let's talk about something that sounds almost like a paradox at first. The human body evolved over millions of years to survive on Earth, yet some scientists believe certain aspects of that same evolutionary history might actually give future Martian settlers an unexpected head start. To understand this, we need to go back, way back, to a time long before humans existed, when life on Earth had to survive conditions almost as hostile as what we'd face on Mars today. Roughly 2.4 billion years ago, Earth experienced something scientists call the Great Oxidation Event. Before that point, our planet's atmosphere had almost no free oxygen at all. Then cyanobacteria, tiny photosynthetic organisms, began pumping oxygen into the atmosphere in massive quantities, essentially poisoning most of the life that existed at the time, because oxygen was toxic to organisms that had evolved without it. What followed was one of the most dramatic evolutionary bottlenecks in the history of life on Earth. Organisms that survived had to rapidly adapt to a completely transformed atmosphere, and the ones that succeeded eventually gave rise to nearly all complex life we see today, including us. Why does this ancient history matter for Mars? Because it proves something important. Life, including human life eventually, carries within it an incredible capacity for radical biological transformation when survival demands it. We are quite literally descendants of organisms that survived one of the most hostile atmospheric transformations in our planet's entire history. Some evolutionary biologists studying extremophiles, organisms that thrive in extreme conditions here on Earth, believe this deep evolutionary resilience is baked into the very architecture of biological life itself, not just in bacteria, but in the genetic toolkit all life on Earth shares, humans included. This brings us to one of the most fascinating areas of modern research relevant to Mars settlement: extremophiles, and what they can teach us about human adaptation. Consider Deinococcus radiodurans, nicknamed by scientists as Conan the bacterium because of its almost unbelievable resistance to radiation. This organism can survive radiation doses thousands of times higher than what would instantly kill a human being, thanks to incredibly efficient DNA repair mechanisms that essentially patch up genetic damage almost as fast as radiation causes it. Researchers studying this bacterium have already begun exploring whether some of its genetic mechanisms could eventually inform biomedical research aimed at improving human radiation resistance. though we're still in relatively early stages of this kind of research, and nothing like genetically modifying humans with these traits is happening today, nor is it something serious scientists are seriously proposing. But here's the interesting evolutionary question researchers are exploring. If a human population lived on Mars for many hundreds or thousands of years, exposed consistently to higher radiation levels than Earth ever experiences on its surface, could natural selection favor individuals with naturally more efficient DNA repair processes, similar in function, though certainly not identical, to what we see in organisms like Deinococcus radiodurans? Some evolutionary biologists believe this is entirely plausible, given enough time and generational turnover. Others are more skeptical, pointing out that meaningful evolutionary change typically requires far more time than even optimistic multi-generational Mars settlement timelines would allow, at least for permanent species-wide changes. This disagreement is actually really healthy for science, and it's worth pausing on here because it reflects something important about how we should think about human evolution on Mars. We don't fully know yet how quickly meaningful adaptive changes could emerge in a genetically isolated population living under such different environmental pressures. Some researchers point to relatively rapid evolutionary changes observed in other species when facing intense environmental pressure, like certain fish populations evolving measurable physical changes within just a few dozen generations when introduced to new environments. Others argue that a small founding population of Martian settlers, likely numbering only in the hundreds or low thousands during early settlement phases, would face significant genetic bottleneck issues, meaning limited genetic diversity to work with in the first place, which could either accelerate or dramatically limit meaningful adaptive change, depending on which traits happen to be present in that original founding population. This is actually one of the most important and most underappreciated factors in any conversation about long-term human settlement on Mars. Population geneticists studying genetic bottlenecks here on Earth, situations where a small group becomes isolated from a larger population, point to real historical examples, like certain island populations or isolated communities that descended from just a handful of original founders, where specific genetic traits became unusually common or unusually rare simply due to random chance in who happened to be part of that original small group. A Mars settlement, especially in its earliest generations, would likely experience something similar. Whatever traits happen to be present or absent in that original founding population could dramatically shape the future biological trajectory of an entire Martian civilization purely by chance, long before any environmental adaptation even had a chance to kick in. Now here's where things get genuinely thought-provoking and honestly a little humbling. Some scientists studying human evolution have pointed out that we've actually already begun altering the natural evolutionary trajectory of our species here on Earth through modern medicine, improved nutrition, and reduced infant mortality, all of which have changed the selective pressures humans face compared to just a few hundred years ago. If humanity eventually establishes a permanent, genetically distinct population on Mars, we may be looking at one of the first instances in recorded history of a human population evolving under genuinely novel environmental pressures, rather than adapting to challenges our species has already faced repeatedly throughout history, like disease, famine, or extreme climates here on Earth. Mars would present something categorically different, a combination of lower gravity, higher radiation, an artificial atmosphere, and a mostly enclosed living environment unlike anything human biology has ever needed to respond to before in our entire evolutionary history. Let's take a moment now to talk about something equally important, but often overlooked: reproduction itself, because it turns out even conceiving and carrying a child might work differently on Mars than it does here on Earth. Research into mammalian reproduction under simulated microgravity and altered gravity conditions is still in relatively early stages, but some studies conducted on rodents in low Earth orbit have raised interesting and sometimes concerning questions about how altered gravity affects reproductive biology. Certain studies have observed changes in bone development, cardiovascular development, and even some aspects of neurological development in animals conceived or raised in microgravity environments compared to those raised under normal Earth gravity. Mars, again, isn't microgravity. Its gravity sits at that 38% of Earth's gravity we mentioned earlier, which is different from the near weightlessness experienced aboard the International Space Station. But scientists studying this question openly acknowledge that we simply don't yet have enough data to fully understand how human pregnancy, fetal development, and early childhood growth would unfold under Martian gravity specifically. This remains one of the significant open questions in space medicine today, and it's an area where actual research, likely involving future missions specifically designed to study mammalian reproduction under partial gravity conditions, will be absolutely essential before any serious long-term settlement effort could responsibly move forward. Some researchers have proposed that if differences do emerge in how human bodies develop under Martian gravity from birth, these differences might not necessarily be worse, just different. A body that develops its bone density, muscle structure, and cardiovascular system while adapted to Martian gravity from conception onward might actually turn out to be remarkably well suited to thriving specifically in that environment, in ways a body that developed under Earth's gravity, then later transported to Mars, simply couldn't replicate. This is actually a really important distinction worth sitting with. The struggles we currently associate with astronauts on the International Space Station and eventually on Mars largely stem from adult human bodies that developed under Earth conditions being suddenly placed into a radically different environment. A person born, raised, and developed entirely under Martian gravity from their very first cell division might experience an entirely different biological reality, one potentially far better adapted to that environment than anything we've studied so far using adult astronauts who spent their formative developmental years here on Earth. This idea that the first truly Martian humans might emerge not through slow evolutionary adaptation over countless generations, but through the simple fact of prenatal and childhood development happening directly under Martian conditions from the very beginning, is one of the more optimistic and genuinely fascinating threads running through current space medicine research. It suggests that becoming Martian might happen faster than we assume, not through millions of years of evolution, but through the natural developmental plasticity every human body already possesses, simply expressed under an entirely new set of environmental conditions from day one. We're really only scratching the surface here of just how deeply Mars could reshape what it even means to be human, biologically speaking, and we haven't even touched yet on the profound psychological shifts required, the kind of mental resilience, social structures, and entirely new forms of human connection that would need to emerge for a Martian society to genuinely thrive rather than merely survive. Let's shift now into something that gets far less attention than bones, muscles, or radiation, but might actually be one of the most decisive factors in whether a Martian civilization survives long-term: the human relationship with food, and how deeply that relationship might need to transform. On Earth, food isn't just fuel. It's tied to culture, memory, celebration, comfort, and identity in ways most of us barely stop to notice because we've never had to live without that abundance. Think about your own life for a second. Think about how many of your happiest memories somehow involve a specific meal, a specific smell, a specific taste tied to a specific place or person. Now imagine a child born on Mars who has never once eaten a mango, never smelled fresh-cut grass, never tasted an apple picked straight from a tree growing wild in an orchard. Every single calorie that child consumes across their entire life will come from carefully engineered greenhouse systems, hydroponic setups, or lab-grown protein sources designed purely for nutritional efficiency and caloric output in a closed environment with zero margin for waste. Researchers studying long-duration space missions have already identified something scientists call menu fatigue, a documented psychological phenomenon where astronauts on extended missions report decreased appetite, reduced meal satisfaction, and even mild depressive symptoms linked directly to eating the same limited rotation of foods for months at a time. NASA has actually invested significant research funding into food variety and food psychologies specifically because of this issue, recognizing that food isn't just about caloric intake when you're isolated for extended periods. It's deeply tied to morale, and morale is deeply tied to mission success. Now scale that challenge up to an entire permanent settlement, not a temporary mission with a return date already scheduled, but a place where children will be born, grow up, and potentially never taste anything beyond what a sealed greenhouse system on Mars can produce. Some psychologists studying isolation environments have raised a genuinely fascinating question here. Would a generation of humans raised entirely without exposure to Earth's natural food diversity develop a fundamentally different relationship with food altogether? Would concepts like comfort food or nostalgic taste even exist in the same way for someone who has never experienced the vast sensory diversity Earth naturally provides? Some researchers speculate that Martian-born children might develop entirely new food traditions and comfort associations built around whatever specific crops and ingredients thrive best in Martian greenhouse conditions, essentially creating an entirely new culinary culture from scratch, one with zero historical connection to anything humans have eaten throughout our entire history on Earth. This actually connects to something deeper happening at a biological level too. Human taste preferences aren't purely psychological. They're shaped significantly by early childhood exposure to specific flavors and textures, a process researchers call flavor programming, which begins even before birth, influenced by what a pregnant mother eats and continues developing rapidly throughout early childhood. A child raised entirely on Martian-grown food, likely featuring a much narrower range of crops optimized for closed-system agriculture, things like leafy greens, certain hardy grains, insect-based protein sources, and lab-cultured meat, might develop taste preferences and even digestive characteristics measurably different from someone raised on Earth's incredibly diverse natural food supply. Some agricultural scientists working specifically on space farming technology have pointed out a particularly interesting challenge here. Certain crops that grow easily and reliably on Earth simply don't perform well in controlled greenhouse environments with artificial lighting, recycled water systems, and Martian soil that requires heavy processing before it can support plant growth at all, largely because Martian regolith contains perchlorates, a class of chemical compounds toxic to most life as we currently understand it. This means early Martian agriculture would likely rely heavily on a genetically selected, relatively narrow range of crops specifically engineered or selectively bred to thrive under these unusual conditions. Over generations, as this narrower agricultural base becomes the only food source an entire population has ever known, it's reasonable to wonder whether human digestive systems themselves might gradually adapt to more efficiently process Whatever specific nutrient profile becomes standard within a Martian diet, similar to how certain human populations here on Earth have evolved measurably different digestive capabilities based on their ancestral diets, like variations in lactose tolerance between populations with different histories of dairy farming. Let's pause here and talk about something equally profound but rarely discussed in mainstream conversations about Mars: language, and how isolation itself might reshape communication over time. Linguists studying isolated populations throughout human history have documented fascinating cases where geographic or social separation led to genuinely new dialects and eventually entirely new languages emerging within just a handful of generations. Consider how quickly Creole languages formed in various isolated communities throughout human history, blending existing languages into something entirely new within remarkably short timeframes, sometimes within a single generation, when communities became sufficiently isolated from their original linguistic roots. A Mars settlement, especially in its early generations, would represent one of the most extreme examples of linguistic isolation in modern human history, with communication delays to Earth stretching anywhere from about 4 minutes to 22 minutes each way depending on planetary alignment. Real-time conversation with Earth simply wouldn't be possible for a Martian population. Every single interaction with Earth would happen through delayed messaging rather than live conversation. Some linguists have speculated that this profound communication gap, combined with the unique shared experiences of Martian settlers, things like the specific vocabulary needed to describe Martian weather patterns, unique social structures born from close-quarters living, or entirely new concepts with no direct Earth equivalent, could accelerate the emergence of distinctly Martian dialects and eventually perhaps distinctly Martian languages, within a surprisingly compressed timeframe compared to how language typically evolves here on Earth. Think about this for a moment. Within just a few generations, would a Martian-born child speaking to their Earth-born grandparent through a recorded video message experience, something similar to how modern English speakers might struggle reading text written in Old English, recognizable as related but distinctly meaningfully different? Some linguists find this entirely plausible given historical precedent for how quickly language shifts within isolated populations. Others argue that constant, if delayed, communication with Earth through digital media, video, and text would likely slow this linguistic divergence considerably compared to historical examples of truly isolated populations who had no ongoing contact with their linguistic origin point whatsoever. Either way, it raises a genuinely fascinating question worth sitting with. If humans on Mars eventually develop distinct biological adaptations, distinct cultural practices, distinct relationships with food, and potentially even distinct linguistic patterns, at what point does a Martian population stop being simply a colony of humans living somewhere else and start being something new entirely, a genuinely distinct branch of humanity related to us, descended from us, but shaped so thoroughly by an entirely different environment that meaningful differences emerge across nearly every dimension of what we currently consider fundamentally human? This isn't a question with a clean, definitive answer today, and honestly, that's part of what makes this entire topic so compelling to explore. We're not just asking whether humans can survive on Mars using better technology and smarter engineering. We're asking a much deeper question about the nature of human identity itself, and what happens to that identity when an entire population experiences generations of accumulated environmental pressure unlike anything our species has ever collectively faced before in our recorded history. Some evolutionary biologists have pointed out that this wouldn't even be an unprecedented event in the broader context of life's history on Earth. Species regularly diverge into distinct populations when geographic separation combines with different environmental pressures over sufficient time, a process called allopatric speciation. Darwin's famous finches on the Galapagos Islands represent one of the most well-known examples, where isolated bird populations developed measurably different beak shapes and sizes based on the specific food sources available on their particular island, all within a relatively short evolutionary time frame compared to how slowly evolution typically unfolds. Humans settling Mars permanently would represent something conceptually similar, though obviously operating on a much longer timescale given how much slower human generational turnover is compared to birds, and given the significant technological and medical interventions humans have available that wild animal populations obviously don't have access to. Now let's talk about something that goes even deeper than biology or language, something that shapes every single human society that has ever existed, social structure itself, and how the unique conditions of Mars might force entirely new forms of human organization that simply don't exist anywhere on Earth today. Think about how human societies typically form. Almost every social structure we recognize today, families, communities, nations, developed within an environment of relative abundance compared to what a Mars settlement would face. Even the poorest regions on Earth still have breathable air, drinkable water sources somewhere nearby, and land that can theoretically grow food without massive artificial intervention. Mars offers none of that as a given. Every single breath a Martian settler takes, every drop of water they drink, every calorie of food they consume has to be actively produced, recycled, or extracted through complex technological systems that require constant maintenance and monitoring. There's no wilderness to retreat into, no natural resource you can simply take for granted the way we do here on Earth without even thinking about it. This changes the entire logic of how a Martian society would likely need to organize itself. Sociologists and researchers who study extreme environments, including Antarctic research stations and long-duration submarine crews, have identified a consistent pattern. As environments become more hostile and interdependent, successful human communities tend towards stricter, more explicit systems of cooperation, resource sharing, and mutual accountability compared to societies existing in more resource-abundant environments. On Mars, this pressure would likely be dramatically amplified. A single malfunctioning oxygen recycling system or a poorly managed water reclamation process wouldn't just be an inconvenience, it could threaten the survival of an entire settlement within hours or days. Researchers who study crew dynamics in extreme isolation, including psychologists working with organizations like NASA and the European Space Agency on long-duration mission simulations, have found that these high-stakes, high-interdependence environments tend to produce very specific social patterns. Individualism, the kind of independent, self-reliant mindset many people, especially in Western cultures, tend to value highly, often becomes a genuine liability in these environments. Instead, successful long-duration isolated communities tend to develop stronger collective decision-making structures, more explicit and formalized communication norms, and significantly reduced tolerance for behaviors that create unnecessary interpersonal conflict simply because conflict itself becomes a resource drain that a fragile, interdependent community literally cannot afford, in the same way a less interdependent society might tolerate. This raises a genuinely fascinating question about what a permanent Martian society might eventually look like, culturally and politically, after multiple generations. Some researchers studying this question have speculated that Martian settlements might naturally trend toward highly structured, almost technocratic forms of governance, where decisions about resource allocation and safety protocols carry significantly more social weight and formal authority than they typically do in Earth societies, where getting those decisions wrong doesn't usually carry immediate life or death consequences for an entire community. Others have pointed out that small, tightly knit communities under extreme pressure sometimes trend the opposite direction, toward highly consensus-based, egalitarian decision-making, because trust and buy-in from every single member becomes essential for a small population to function when everyone's survival depends on everyone else following shared protocols without hesitation or resentment. We actually have some limited real-world precedent for this kind of environment here on Earth already, though obviously nowhere near as extreme as Mars would be. Antarctic research stations, where crews live in extreme isolation, harsh climate conditions, and complete interdependence for months at a time, have developed their own unique social norms and even their own particular slang and shared cultural references specific to that environment. Researchers who study these stations have documented measurable psychological and social shifts among long-term Antarctic crew members, including changes in how they perceive personal space, privacy, and even their sense of time passing, given the extreme light conditions during Antarctic summer and winter months. Multiply that isolation by an enormous factor. Add in the complete inability to simply leave and return home whenever you choose, since Mars only has resupply missions during specific orbital alignment windows roughly every 26 months, and you start to get a sense of just how intensely a Martian settlement's social fabric might need to adapt compared to even our most extreme Earth-based examples. There's another layer worth exploring here too, something psychologists who study long-duration isolation call third-quarter phenomenon. Researchers have observed that crews in extended isolation missions, whether in Antarctic stations, submarine deployments, or space station missions, tend to experience the most significant psychological strain not at the very beginning of a mission, when everything is novel and exciting, and not right at the very end, when the finish line is close enough to provide motivation, but specifically during the middle portion of a long mission, roughly the third quarter of the total duration, when the novelty has completely worn off but the end still feels distant. For a Mars mission, or an actual permanent settlement where there effectively is no end date at all, this psychological phenomenon becomes an entirely different kind of challenge. How do you maintain psychological resilience and motivation in a population where there's no eventual return to Earth to look forward to, where the mission itself has become simply life indefinitely for that person and potentially for their children as well? This is where researchers studying space psychology have started exploring something genuinely fascinating: the idea that long-term Martian settlers might need to develop an entirely different psychological relationship with the concept of home itself. For nearly all of human history, our sense of home has been deeply tied to Earth, to specific landscapes, specific weather patterns, specific sensory experiences we associate with comfort and belonging. A person born and raised entirely on Mars would never experience any of those specific Earth-based associations firsthand. Their sense of home, their deepest psychological anchor point, would be built entirely around Martian landscapes, Martian weather patterns, Martian light, and Martian community structures. Some psychologists studying this question suggest this could actually work in favor of long-term Martian settlement success, because a population that has never known anything else and therefore has nothing to compare their experience against or feel nostalgic for might develop a far more secure and stable sense of belonging to their environment than any Earth-born settler ever could. no matter how well adapted that Earth-born settler eventually becomes. This connects to a broader psychological concept researchers call place attachment, essentially the deep emotional and psychological bond humans form with specific physical environments over time. Interestingly, some research into place attachment suggests that this bond isn't primarily about the objective qualities of a location itself, meaning how beautiful, comfortable, or resource-rich a place actually is, but rather about the depth and duration of lived experience within that environment, combined with the social relationships and personal memories tied to it. This suggests something genuinely hopeful for the long-term psychological viability of Mars settlement. A child born on Mars, surrounded by loving family, meaningful work, and a supportive community, might form just as deep, just as secure, and just as psychologically healthy an attachment to their Martian home as any Earth-born child forms toward their own home planet, entirely independent of the fact that their home happens to be a sealed habitat on a cold, red, distant world rather than the blue-green, oxygen-rich planet their ancestors originally came from. Let's also talk briefly about something that researchers studying isolated communities consistently flag as critically important: ritual and ceremony. Human societies throughout history have consistently developed rituals tied to major life events: birth, coming of age, marriage, death, and to natural cycles like seasons, harvests, and astronomical events. These rituals aren't just cultural decoration. Anthropologists studying ritual behavior across human cultures argue that these practices serve genuinely important psychological functions, providing structure, meaning, and a sense of continuity that helps communities process major transitions and maintain psychological stability over time. A Martian settlement would almost certainly need to develop entirely new rituals suited to its unique environment and circumstances, since so many Earth-based rituals are deeply tied to Earth-specific natural phenomena that simply don't exist on Mars in the same form. Things like traditional seasonal harvest festivals, celebrations tied to specific weather patterns, or religious and cultural practices historically tied to specific geographic locations on Earth, that a Martian-born population would have no direct ancestral connection to whatsoever. Some researchers studying isolated communities suggest that watching new rituals emerge organically within a genuinely novel human settlement like Mars could actually provide social scientists with an unprecedented real-time case study into exactly how and why human ritual behavior develops in the first place, something we currently only understand through historical reconstruction and observation of existing cultures, rather than through direct observation of an entirely new culture forming from scratch in real time. Let's shift now into a topic that might sound less philosophical and more practical at first glance, but actually carries enormous implications for how a Martian society would function: economics, and the genuinely strange question of what money, value, and trade might even mean on a planet where scarcity operates according to completely different rules than it does here on Earth. On Earth, our entire economic system at its core is built around managing scarcity. Some resources are abundant, some are rare, and prices, markets, and trade systems exist largely to efficiently allocate limited resources among competing needs and wants. Mars flips this entire framework on its head in some fascinating ways. Certain things that are essentially free and unlimited on Earth, breathable air, drinkable water, arable land, become the single most precious, tightly controlled resources imaginable on Mars, produced only through complex technological systems requiring constant energy input and careful maintenance. Meanwhile, things that carry enormous value on Earth, precious metals, certain rare minerals, might actually turn out to be relatively abundant on Mars, depending on what settlers eventually discover through Martian mining and resource extraction. Economists who have started seriously exploring this question point out that a Martian economy would likely need to be organized around an entirely different value hierarchy than anything we're familiar with. Some researchers have proposed that early Martian settlements might function less like a traditional market economy and more like what economists call a life support economy, where the fundamental unit of value isn't currency in the traditional sense, but rather verified access to and contribution toward essential survival resources, oxygen production, water reclamation, food cultivation, and energy generation. In this kind of system, a person's economic value to the community might be measured far more directly by their demonstrated contribution to these core survival systems than by more abstract measures of wealth we're used to on Earth, like accumulated capital or property ownership. This actually connects to something researchers studying closed ecological systems have pointed out repeatedly: the absolute necessity of near-total resource efficiency in any sustainable Mars settlement. On Earth, we can afford enormous inefficiency in how we produce, distribute, and consume resources because our planet's ecosystem has essentially unlimited natural buffering capacity built up over billions of years of planetary evolution. A sealed Martian habitat has no such buffer. Every gram of waste, every unit of energy, every liter of water needs to be tracked, recycled, and reused as efficiently as technologically possible, because there's no larger natural system to absorb inefficiency the way Earth's atmosphere, oceans, and ecosystems currently do for us without most of us ever even noticing. Given this reality, some researchers studying space settlement economics have proposed that early Martian communities might actually need to operate closer to a resource-sharing or cooperative model rather than a competitive market model, at least during the earliest, most fragile phases of settlement, simply because pure market competition for genuinely life-critical resources like oxygen or water could create dangerous incentives, hoarding, artificial scarcity, or price gouging around resources where any interruption in access could mean death within hours or days rather than mere inconvenience. This is a fundamentally different situation than anything most market economics theory was originally designed to address, since our existing economic models developed within a context of relative resource abundance where scarcity, while real, rarely carried truly immediate life or death stakes for most transactions most of the time. That said, other economists studying this question have pushed back against the idea that market principles would need to be abandoned entirely on Mars. Some argue that market mechanisms, properly regulated, could still play an important role even in resource-scarce environments, particularly for goods and services beyond the absolute baseline of survival resources, things like specialized labor, technical expertise, personal services, or eventually, if Martian settlements grow large enough, genuinely discretionary goods like entertainment, art, or specialty foods grown in smaller quantities beyond the basic nutritional staples most of the population depends on. The debate here largely echoes broader ongoing debates in economics generally about the appropriate balance between market mechanisms and centrally coordinated resource allocation, just transplanted into a genuinely novel and extreme environment where the stakes of getting that balance wrong are dramatically higher than in almost any Earth-based economic context we currently have direct experience with. Now let's talk about legal systems and governance, because this is another area where Mars presents genuinely unprecedented challenges that current Earth-based legal frameworks simply weren't designed to handle. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, still the primary international legal framework governing space activity today, establishes that no nation can claim sovereignty over celestial bodies, including Mars. This made a lot of sense as an early framework meant to prevent Cold War-era space competition from turning into a new form of colonial land grabbing among competing nations, but it leaves enormous, largely unresolved questions about how governance would actually work for a permanent, growing human settlement on Mars, questions the treaty's original authors never seriously had to grapple with because permanent human settlement on another planet was at the time considered a distant hypothetical rather than a genuinely approaching possibility. Legal scholars studying this question have identified numerous unresolved issues that would need serious attention long before any large-scale permanent Mars settlement could reasonably proceed. Who has legal authority to create and enforce laws within a Martian settlement? If a serious crime occurs on Mars, whose legal jurisdiction applies, especially if the settlement includes citizens from multiple different Earth nations, private companies, or international coalitions? How would property rights work, particularly around resource extraction, given that current international space law prohibits national territorial claims but says relatively little about the rights of private companies or individuals to extract and own specific resources they've invested enormous resources into accessing? What happens to fundamental legal concepts like citizenship, voting rights, or due process for people born on Mars who have never set foot on Earth and may have no meaningful legal or cultural connection to whatever nation their parents originally came from? Some legal scholars have proposed that Mars settlement might eventually require, or at least strongly benefit from, an entirely new international legal framework specifically designed for off-world settlements rather than trying to awkwardly stretch existing Earth-based legal concepts to fit a context they were never designed to address. Others point out that history offers some interesting, if imperfect, precedent here. Antarctic governance, for example, operates under a unique international treaty system, the Antarctic Treaty System, that established Antarctica as a scientific preserve free from national sovereignty claims and military activity, while still allowing multiple nations to operate research stations there under cooperative international agreements. Some researchers studying space law have suggested Mars governance might eventually evolve towards something conceptually similar, though the practical challenges of governing a location 4 times more distant than the most remote point on Earth, with communication delays measured in minutes rather than seconds, and genuinely life or death daily stakes tied to shared infrastructure, would create governance challenges considerably more complex than anything the Antarctic Treaty System was ever designed to handle. There's also a genuinely fascinating psychological and philosophical dimension to this governance question worth exploring. Some researchers have pointed out that the extreme interdependence required for basic survival on Mars might naturally push governance systems toward prioritizing collective welfare and system stability over certain individual liberties that Earth-based democratic societies currently consider fundamental and non-negotiable. This raises uncomfortable but genuinely important questions. Would a Martian settlement's survival needs justify restricting certain individual freedoms Earth citizens currently take for granted? Freedom of movement within the settlement during resource shortages, mandatory participation in essential maintenance work, or restrictions on reproduction tied to the settlement's actual capacity to support additional population growth. These aren't questions with comfortable, easy answers, and they represent exactly the kind of genuinely difficult ethical territory that any serious, long-term Mars settlement effort would eventually need to confront directly, rather than simply assuming Earth-based political and legal traditions would translate cleanly into this radically different context without requiring serious rethinking. Let's turn now to a question that sits right at the intersection of biology, ethics, and long-term survival strategy, reproduction on Mars, and why this seemingly straightforward biological process might actually become one of the most scientifically and ethically complicated aspects of permanent Martian settlement. We touched briefly earlier on some of the physical challenges pregnancy might face in reduced gravity, but the full picture here is considerably more complex and worth exploring in real depth. Human pregnancy evolved over millions of years under very specific conditions: Earth's gravity, Earth's atmospheric pressure, Earth's radiation levels, and a stable, predictable environment that fetal development processes have become exquisitely fine-tuned to depend upon. Mars offers a dramatically different set of conditions across nearly every one of these variables simultaneously, and researchers studying reproductive biology in altered environments have raised serious, legitimate concerns about whether human reproduction can actually succeed reliably under Martian conditions without significant medical intervention, technological support, or potentially even genetic or biological modification. Let's start with gravity's effect on fetal development specifically. We know that reduced gravity significantly impacts bone density and muscle mass in fully developed adults, but researchers studying developmental biology point out that the effects on a developing fetus could be considerably more severe and fundamentally different in nature, not just in degree. Human skeletal development, particularly bone density and structural formation, is heavily influenced by mechanical loading forces during fetal and early childhood development, essentially the physical forces exerted by gravity and movement that help signal bones and muscles how to properly form and strengthen during critical developmental windows. In Mars's roughly 38% gravity environment, a developing fetus would experience dramatically reduced mechanical loading throughout the entire gestational period, and researchers simply don't yet know whether this would result in a child born with permanently altered skeletal structure, different bone density baselines, or other structural differences that might not be correctable later in life, even with intervention, specifically because these formative signals may only be receivable during certain critical developmental windows that, once passed, cannot be recreated afterward. There's also a significant concern around radiation exposure during pregnancy specifically. We discussed earlier how Mars's thin atmosphere and lack of a global magnetic field expose the surface to significantly higher radiation levels than Earth. Developing fetal tissue is generally understood to be considerably more vulnerable to radiation-induced cellular damage than adult tissue, given how rapidly fetal cells divide and differentiate during gestation. Researchers studying radiation biology have pointed out that even with heavily shielded habitats designed to minimize radiation exposure for the general Martian population, pregnant individuals might require even more stringent radiation protection measures, essentially near total shielding throughout pregnancy, to bring fetal radiation exposure down to levels considered acceptably safe based on what we currently understand about radiation risks to fetal development. This raises a genuinely difficult question worth confronting directly. Given these compounding risks, some researchers and bioethicists studying space settlement have seriously proposed that early-generation Martian settlements might need to rely primarily on artificial reproductive technologies rather than natural pregnancy, at least during the initial decades of settlement, while long-term data on Martian pregnancy outcomes remains limited or entirely absent. This could include technologies like artificial wombs, which remain in relatively early stages of research and development even here on Earth, but which some researchers argue could eventually provide a considerably safer, more controlled environment for fetal development than a pregnant person's body could reliably provide under Martian conditions. at least until we have significantly more data and improved technological solutions available. This naturally raises significant ethical questions that bioethicists have already started grappling with, even though large-scale Mars settlement remains years or decades away. Is it ethical to potentially subject a first generation of pregnant settlers and their unborn children to unknown and potentially serious reproductive health risks in service of humanity's broader multi-planetary ambitions? Would settlers who choose to become pregnant on Mars be considered to be freely and knowingly accepting risks, similar to how astronauts accept known risks when volunteering for dangerous missions? Or does bringing a child into that risk equation, a child who obviously cannot consent to the risks their biological development might face, fundamentally change the ethical calculation in ways that require far more caution than we might otherwise apply to adult volunteers making decisions solely about their own personal risk tolerance? Some bioethicists have pushed this question even further into genuinely uncomfortable but important territory. If natural human reproduction proves too risky or unreliable under Martian conditions, at least in the near term, would this create pressure toward genetic modification of human embryos specifically intended for Martian settlers, essentially engineering specific biological adaptations, things like enhanced radiation resistance, different bone density regulation, or altered cardiovascular characteristics better suited to permanent low-gravity living, directly into a Martian-born population from birth? This connects directly back to our earlier discussion about human evolution and whether Martian settlers might eventually diverge into a biologically distinct population, except here we're talking about a potentially much faster, deliberately engineered version of that divergence, rather than a slow, unplanned evolutionary process unfolding naturally across many generations of unassisted natural selection. This is obviously deeply controversial territory, and for good reason. Human genetic modification, particularly modification intended to be passed down to future generations rather than limited to a single individual, sits at the center of some of the most contentious ethical debates in all of modern bioscience, well beyond just the specific context of space settlement. Some researchers argue that if genetic modification could meaningfully reduce serious health risks for Martian-born children compared to leaving those children biologically unprepared for the environment they'll be raised in, there's a reasonably strong ethical case for pursuing it carefully and transparently with appropriate oversight and consent frameworks. Others argue forcefully that deliberately engineering permanent genetic changes into an entire population specifically to make them better suited for a harsh, artificial environment raises deeply troubling questions about human dignity, genetic diversity, and the uncomfortable historical echoes of eugenics-adjacent thinking, even when the stated motivations behind the effort are framed in an entirely different, more benevolent context, focused on genuine safety and long-term well-being, rather than any form of discriminatory ideology. There's no clean resolution to this debate currently, and honestly, there may never be one that satisfies everyone across such fundamentally different ethical frameworks and value systems. But it's exactly the kind of question that becomes unavoidable once you seriously start planning for permanent, multi-generational human settlement beyond Earth, rather than simply focusing on shorter duration missions where astronauts return to Earth's environment. Before these kinds of serious long-term reproductive and generational concerns can develop into genuinely urgent decision points. There's one more dimension of this conversation worth touching on here: population planning itself. Given the hard resource constraints of any closed Martian habitat, particularly during the earliest decades of settlement when food production, water reclamation, and life support systems would still be operating with relatively limited capacity and minimal redundancy. Some researchers have pointed out that Martian settlements might need to implement genuinely unprecedented levels of deliberate population planning, potentially including formal limits on birth rates tied directly to verified life support capacity, in ways that would represent a significant departure from how most Earth-based societies currently think about reproductive freedom and family planning as a fundamentally private, individual choice largely free from direct governmental control or mandate. This is another area where the extreme, unforgiving physical constraints of Martian settlement might force genuinely uncomfortable trade-offs between individual liberty and collective survival, trade-offs that most people living comfortably here on Earth, with its enormous natural resource buffers and redundant life support systems, we don't even consciously think about as life support because they're simply built into the fabric of how our planet naturally functions, have simply never had to seriously confront in any meaningful, immediate way within their own lifetimes. Let's shift gears now and talk about something that touches almost every aspect of daily life we've discussed so far, but deserves its own dedicated exploration: technology dependency, and what happens to human psychology and society when literally every aspect of survival runs through machines that can, and eventually will, fail. Here on Earth, even people living in extremely technology-dependent, modern societies still maintain what psychologists call a backup relationship with the natural world, even if most of us rarely think about it consciously. If the power grid fails, we can still breathe the air outside. If water treatment systems break down temporarily, natural water sources still exist, even if we'd need to treat them before drinking. This creates a kind of underlying psychological safety net, an unconscious awareness that even in worst-case technological failure scenarios, the planet itself continues providing certain baseline survival conditions independent of any human-engineered system. If you're enjoying this deeper dive into the biology and psychology behind Mars settlement rather than just the technical challenges, I'd really appreciate a like on this video. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time. It helps this channel keep growing, and it lets me keep making content exactly like this. Mars offers no such safety net whatsoever. Every single life-sustaining system, oxygen generation, water reclamation, temperature regulation, radiation shielding, food production, exists entirely because of continuously functioning technology that requires constant power, maintenance, and monitoring. There is no natural backup. Step outside without a suit for even a few minutes, and the near-vacuum atmospheric pressure alone would cause fatal injury within a very short window, entirely separate from the effects of the extreme cold or lack of breathable oxygen. This total dependency creates a genuinely unique psychological condition that researchers studying isolated and extreme environments have started calling technological vulnerability awareness, essentially a persistent low-level psychological awareness that one's continued survival depends entirely on complex systems outside one's direct personal control, functioning correctly at all times. Without exception, psychologists who study extreme environments point out that this kind of persistent vulnerability awareness, if not carefully managed, can contribute significantly to chronic background anxiety, even among psychologically resilient, well-trained individuals. Interestingly, though, research into how experienced submarine crews, nuclear power plant operators, and commercial airline pilots psychologically manage similarly high-stakes technological dependency offers some genuinely useful insight here. These professionals, who also depend heavily on complex technological systems functioning correctly for their own survival or the survival of others, generally don't report living in a constant state of active anxiety despite operating in environments where system failure could have catastrophic consequences. Researchers studying this phenomenon have identified a few key factors that seem to explain why. First, deep technical understanding of the systems you depend on appears to significantly reduce anxiety compared to a more passive, black box relationship with the same technology. People who genuinely understand how a system works, including its failure modes and the redundancies built in to address those failure modes, tend to experience considerably less anxiety about that system than people who simply use the system without understanding its underlying mechanics, even when both groups face identical objective risk levels. This suggests that a genuinely successful Martian settlement would need to prioritize technical literacy across its entire population to a degree that goes considerably beyond what's currently expected of ordinary citizens in most Earth-based societies, essentially treating deep understanding of life support systems as a core educational requirement for every settler, rather than specialized knowledge reserved only for designated technical staff. Second, redundancy itself appears to play an enormous role in psychological comfort, separate from its obvious practical safety benefits. Knowing that a critical system has multiple independent backup systems and genuinely understanding how those backups function seems to provide meaningful psychological reassurance beyond simply the abstract safety statistics involved. This has direct implications for how Martian settlement infrastructure would likely need to be designed, not just for practical engineering reasons, but specifically to support long-term psychological well-being among the settlers who depend on that infrastructure every single day of their lives. Third, and this connects back to something we touched on earlier regarding community structure, distributed responsibility for critical systems appears to reduce anxiety more effectively than centralizing that responsibility in a small specialized group. When ordinary community members have genuine, hands-on involvement in monitoring and maintaining critical systems, rather than simply trusting a separate technical class to handle it entirely on their behalf, research suggests this tends to produce both better practical outcomes, since more eyes and hands are actively engaged in system monitoring, and better psychological outcomes, since community members develop a genuine sense of agency and control over their own survival conditions, rather than feeling like passive, powerless dependence on systems entirely outside their understanding or influence. This has fascinating implications for how a Mars settlement might need to structure both its physical infrastructure and its educational and social systems. Rather than the relatively specialized, siloed expertise structure common in most Earth-based technological societies, where most people have little to no understanding of how their electrical grid, water treatment, or food supply chains actually function on a technical level, a Martian settlement might need to cultivate something closer to universal baseline technical competency across its entire population, essentially requiring every settler, regardless of their primary role or profession, to maintain genuine working knowledge of core life support systems, sufficient not necessarily to perform advanced repairs, but at least to understand system status, recognize early warning signs of malfunction, and know exactly how to respond appropriately during various emergency scenarios. There's an interesting historical parallel worth mentioning here. Some researchers studying frontier societies throughout human history point out that genuinely dangerous, resource-scarce frontier environments have often historically produced populations with unusually broad, generalized skill sets compared to more established, comfortable societies, essentially because survival in those environments required most individuals to maintain competency across a much wider range of essential skills than would be practical or necessary in a safer, more resource-abundant environment where specialized division of labor makes more practical sense. A Martian settlement facing genuinely unprecedented levels of technological interdependency and vulnerability might represent an extreme, technologically sophisticated version of this same historical pattern, essentially becoming a uniquely generalist society, at least in terms of baseline technical literacy, even while still maintaining specialized expertise in specific advanced technical and scientific fields necessary for the settlement's more complex ongoing operations and research goals. This also raises interesting questions about educational systems for children born and raised on Mars. If universal technical literacy regarding life support systems becomes a core requirement for meaningful participation in Martian society, this would likely need to be built directly into childhood education from a very early age, essentially treating deep understanding of atmospheric processing, water reclamation, and energy systems as being just as fundamental to a Martian child's education as reading, writing, and basic mathematics are considered fundamental to childhood education here on Earth. Some researchers studying this question have speculated that Martian-born children might develop a genuinely different relationship with technology and engineering concepts compared to Earth-born children, viewing these systems not as abstract, specialized topics reserved for particular career paths, but as basic, essential life knowledge every capable person needs to understand simply to participate fully and safely in their own community's daily survival. In much the same way, most Earth-based children are taught basic knowledge about food safety or personal hygiene as fundamental life skills rather than specialized professional training. Let's bring together a thread that's been running underneath much of this conversation: identity. What does it actually mean to be human once a population lives permanently on another planet, raises children who've never touched Earth's soil, breathes air that's manufactured rather than simply inhaled from a planet's atmosphere, and organizes its economy, laws, and reproduction around survival logic? Earth has never had to apply at scale. Sociologists studying isolated and extreme communities point out that identity tends to form most strongly around shared struggle and shared dependency, not shared comfort. Mars, almost by definition, guarantees an enormous amount of both. A second or third generation of Martian settlers, people who have never seen an ocean, never breathed unfiltered air, never experienced Earth's gravity pulling at their bones, would likely develop a cultural and even biological identity distinct enough that Martian could eventually stop being a geographic descriptor and start being something closer to a genuinely separate branch of human identity, culturally and possibly eventually biologically distinct from Earth-based humanity. This raises one final, genuinely open question worth sitting with. Would that divergence represent humanity's greatest act of expansion and resilience, or the slow beginning of two separate human stories that no longer fully understand each other? Researchers studying long-term space settlement don't agree on the answer, and honestly, no one currently alive will know for certain, because the timescales involved stretch across generations that haven't been born yet. What all of this ultimately reveals is that settling Mars was never really just an engineering problem. Even though rockets, habitats, and life support systems tend to dominate the public conversation, it's simultaneously a psychological problem, a legal problem, an economic problem, a reproductive and ethical problem, and ultimately an identity problem, all bundled into a single unprecedented human undertaking. Every system we've discussed, governance, economy, community structure, reproduction, technology dependency, is deeply interconnected with all the others, meaning that success or failure in a Martian settlement would rarely come down to a single point of failure, but rather to how well all of these deeply human dimensions were considered and prepared for long before the first permanent settlers ever arrived. At the end of the day, the story of settling Mars isn't really a story about a red, dusty, distant planet at all. It's a story about us. It's about what happens to human psychology, human relationships, human bodies, and human values when we strip away every comfort and safety net our home planet has quietly provided for our entire existence as a species, and ask ourselves what's actually left standing. Mars, in that sense, isn't just humanity's next destination. It's the ultimate mirror, forcing us to confront, plan for, and rebuild almost every system we've ever taken for granted. From the air we breathe to the laws we live by, to the very meaning of family and community. Whether or not we ever call Mars home, grappling honestly with these questions now makes us better equipped to understand what we truly need as a species to survive and thrive anywhere, including right here on Earth.